Every generation swears their cartoons were harmless, until you watch the uncut reels and realize what networks tried to hide. The 1,960 seconds may look like a time of groovy fun and family television, but dig a little deeper and you'll find edits, bans, and scenes wiped away like they never happened. So, what innocent cartoons were secretly clipped for being too much? Stick around. Some of the cuts will leave you stunned. The Jetsons, 1,962, 1,963. When people think of the Jetsons, they imagine flying cars, robot maids, and a shiny future full of convenience. What they don't expect is controversy. But the truth is, the original run of this Hanna-Barbera hit didn't survive the scissors unscathed. Networks went back and trimmed episodes during reruns, and not just for pacing. They sliced away jokes and habits that suddenly felt too adult for Saturday mornings. One of the most glaring edits involved George Jetson himself. In certain original episodes, George casually lights up cigars, even cracking one-liners while puffing smoke into the futuristic sky. It might have looked like just another gag in the early 1,960 seconds, but by the time the show was recycled in the late decade, networks panicked. Those moments were cut clean, leaving awkward pauses where the scenes once stood. Jane Jetson wasn't safe either. Some of her sharper lines about household life and marital squabbles were toned down, turning her from a witty character into something blander. Even the episode Rosie's Boyfriend got trimmed, with entire moments edited out to smooth over humor that leaned too sarcastic. And here's the kicker. Overseas edits went even further, chopping scenes that showed robots behaving in rebellious ways, which was viewed as a strange influence for kids. The uncut versions survive today in DVD releases and online archives, and they feel shockingly different. The pacing is sharper, the humor a little edgier, and the family dynamics a lot more real. What censorship did was drain out the quirks that made the Jetsons more than just a space-age sitcom. Looking back, it's clear this cartoon wasn't banned everywhere, but it was definitely butchered into something tamer. And that's what makes the uncut footage such a fascinating time capsule, proof that even in the safe 1,960 seconds, cartoons carried edges networks couldn't handle. Tom and Jerry, 1,960. By the 1,960 seconds, Tom and Jerry had already built a reputation as the ultimate cat and mouse slapstick showdown. MGM's famous duo had been chasing, smacking, and scheming since the 1,940 seconds, and kids adored every second. But when CBS decided to package the cartoons for heavy reruns in the 1,960 seconds, the scissors came out, and they didn't hold back. The edits weren't about trimming runtime. They were about erasing entire cultural and behavioral elements. One of the first targets was the housemaid character, Mammy Two Shoes. In the original shorts, she had a strong presence, complete with comedic scolding whenever Tom messed up. But networks in the 60 seconds decided she didn't fit the new, cleaner image of Saturday morning programming. Her dialogue was dubbed over, her role minimized, and in some reruns, she was erased altogether. But the cuts didn't stop there. Cigarette gags, pipe-smoking bits, and scenes of Jerry luring Tom with a drink all vanished. Even slapstick involving firecrackers, rifles, or more exaggerated mayhem was either snipped out or softened. The result? A choppy version of Tom and Jerry that often didn't make sense, with jokes leading to setups that never paid off. Kids watching those reruns had no idea entire sequences were missing. Collectors and fans later uncovered the uncut originals, and the difference is night and day. The full versions are sharper, more daring, and a lot funnier because the rhythm of the gags stays intact. What's most interesting is that the edits didn't kill the show's popularity. It thrived, despite being trimmed down. But if you've ever felt like Tom and Jerry reruns looked oddly incomplete, you weren't wrong. The 1,960-second syndication versions were butchered into a safe product, while the uncut reels show the full chaos MGM originally intended. Looney Tunes and Merry Melodies, 1,960. By the 1,960 seconds, Bugs Bunny, Daffy Duck, and Porky Pig had already become icons. But when their classic shorts were recycled for Saturday morning television, they didn't come back the same. The network executives wanted these to be safe, cheerful reruns, but the reality was something else. Whole chunks of animation disappeared, creating versions that felt hollow compared to the originals. The most notorious edits were aimed at cultural stereotypes. Any gag that even brushed against caricatures of different communities was snipped. Networks feared backlash, and so entire jokes, and sometimes full cartoons, simply vanished from lineups. Then came the issue of slapstick. The original Looney Tunes shorts were full of dynamite blasts, explosives, and too intense pratfalls. By the mid-1960 seconds, censors were convinced kids couldn't handle them. So instead of Bugs Bunny outsmarting Elmer Fudd with his usual over-the-top tricks, viewers often got abrupt cuts that ended scenes before the punchline hit. Smoking was another easy target. Characters lighting cigars or puffing away at pipes were edited out completely. What survived were confusing edits, where dialogue or music cues suddenly made no sense. In some cases, characters were mid-sentence 1 second, then in a totally different setting the next. Fans who only saw the syndicated cuts never knew what they were missing. Collectors who tracked down the uncut versions noticed just how much sharper and braver the humor was in its original form. The edits dulled the bite of the series and made it look tamer than it ever was. Ironically, those raw versions are the ones that built Looney Tunes' reputation in the first place. What happened in the 1960 seconds was less about preserving art and more about making Saturday mornings feel like a bubble. And yet, the truth slipped through anyway. Bugs Bunny and his crew proved too big to censor completely. The uncut reels, now widely available, reveal the wild, clever, and unapologetically bold humor that the 60 seconds versions buried. Quick Draw McGraw, 1959, 1961. Quick Draw McGraw was Hanna-Barbera's answer to the Western craze, and he came packing with a twist. His alter ego, El Kabong, who loved nothing more than smashing villains over the head with his trusty guitar. At the time, it was seen as slapstick fun. But by the 1960 seconds, when the show was re-aired in syndication, censors had second thoughts. The edits started small. Scenes of Quick Draw firing his six-shooter at outlaws were shortened or erased entirely. Suddenly, the cowboy hero was waving his arm without any clear payoff. Then, El Kabong's antics became the main target. The gag of a character being walloped with a guitar was deemed too violent for kids. In several reruns, his signature moves were cut down, leaving entire episodes feeling disjointed. What had once been the show's biggest punchline now looked like a glitch. But it wasn't just the slapstick. Some of the caricatures of Mexican bandits and side characters raised eyebrows. By the mid-60 seconds, stations worried these depictions would come off as offensive, so edits swept through those moments, sometimes cutting full characters from an episode. This made the plots thinner, with storylines skipping beats. The uncut versions today show exactly why Quick Draw stood out. They're sharper, faster, and unapologetically goofy in a way the reruns weren't. Watching them now, you realize El Kabong was one of Hanna-Barbera's boldest characters, but that boldness got dulled in the rush to sanitize TV for kids. What's funny is that the very gags censored are the ones fans still remember decades later. Quick Draw may not be the biggest star from the Hanna-Barbera stable, but his butchered history shows how even the goofiest cartoons were reshaped under 1960 seconds network scissors. Top Cat, 1000, 961 1000, 962. Top Cat strutted onto television screens as the coolest cat in town, running a gang of alley cats with quick wit and slick schemes. But behind the jazzy theme song and bright colors, Top Cat had more edge than most Saturday morning fare. And that edge didn't sit well with censors once reruns hit the airwaves later in the decade. The trouble was simple. Top Cat leaned into street-smart humor. The characters hustled, gambled, and often outwitted the local beat cop, Officer Dibble. It was satire disguised as slapstick. But by the mid-1960 seconds, networks worried parents would complain about kids idolizing alley cats who bent the rules. So the scissors came out. Jokes about gambling vanished. Scenes of the gang playing cards or making shady deals were trimmed. Officer Dibble's blunders were softened too, because making law enforcement look foolish was suddenly too disrespectful for a cartoon. The edits made reruns clunky. Without the full back and forth between Top Cat and his crew, the comedy lost its punch. Overseas broadcasters went even further. In the UK, episodes were shortened to remove slang-heavy dialogue, worried that some phrases would come off as too rough for children. What was left behind often felt flat. The uncut versions reveal how clever Top Cat really was. The show was never about promoting bad behavior. It was about outsmarting authority with charm and wit. The cats were misfits, yes, but they were also survivors in a world stacked against them. That little spark of rebellion made the show unforgettable. By scrubbing it, networks drained away the personality that made Top Cat stand apart from safer Hanna-Barbera series like the Flintstones. Today, the uncut episodes feel sharper, funnier, and more honest, proof that Top Cat was never just a kid's cartoon. It was sly, daring, and ahead of its time. Beany and Cecil, 1962. At first glance, Beany and Cecil looked like harmless fun, a cheerful boy with his sea serpent pal setting off on slapstick adventures. But under the surface, Bob Clampett's cartoon carried the same mischievous streak he brought to his earlier Looney Tunes work, and in the 1960 seconds, that streak didn't sit well with everyone. The show often relied on satire, parodying everything from TV personalities to American pop culture. Clampett slipped in cheeky jabs at Hollywood and politics, but that wasn't what got censors nervous. The real edits came when certain characters leaned too heavily on exaggerated cultural stereotypes. In reruns, broadcasters clipped out entire gags, sometimes trimming whole chunks of episodes. This left awkward pauses and storylines that made less sense, all in the name of protecting young audiences. Another sore spot was the humor's edge. Beany might start as a wide-eyed adventurer, but Cecil often dropped one-liners sharp enough to rattle nervous parents. Satire aimed at adults was masked in bright colors, which led watchdog groups to complain that kids weren't ready for jokes that undercut authority figures or mocked traditions. Reruns dialed down that edge, and international broadcasters were even stricter. Certain episodes never aired in full, outside the U.S. What remains in the uncut versions is a glimpse at Clampett's true style, bold, chaotic, and unafraid to ruffle feathers. Beany and Cecil may not get as much attention today as other Hanna-Barbera hits, but its butchered history shows just how quickly a cartoon could shift from clever to too risky. For fans, the uncut reels are a revelation. The show's humor lands stronger, the timing is sharper, and the satire hits home. It wasn't banned everywhere, but in plenty of places, Beany and Cecil was trimmed until it barely resembled the original. Johnny Quest, 1964, 1965. When Johnny Quest premiered, it looked nothing like the safe and goofy cartoons kids were used to. This was an action-adventure series, packed with jetpacks, exotic locations, and villains that weren't afraid to threaten real danger. Parents expecting harmless fun were in for a surprise, and so were the censors. The show didn't shy away from intensity. Villains carried serious firepower, henchmen often met harsh fates, and Johnny's scientist father regularly found himself in life-or-death standoffs. For a cartoon marketed to kids, it was unusually realistic, almost cinematic. By the time reruns hit in the late 1960 seconds, networks had second thoughts. Scenes of fistfights and close calls were chopped down. In some edits, enemies who clearly didn't survive encounters were softened to look like they simply fell off screen with no explanation. Another layer of censorship came with the character Haji. As one of Johnny's closest friends, Haji brought diversity to the team, but his portrayal leaned heavily on mystical powers and exotic stereotypes. By the late 60 seconds, reruns clipped or redubbed dialogue, toning down anything deemed insensitive. Overseas broadcasters often cut these episodes entirely. The problem with all the edits? The pacing. Johnny Quest was designed like a serialized thriller. Cutting out action sequences made episodes feel rushed and disjointed, leaving viewers confused about how the heroes escaped danger. Fans who later discovered the uncut versions realized just how groundbreaking the show really was. It wasn't just a cartoon, it was an animated adventure show that treated its audience like they could handle suspense. The irony is that the very elements censors tried to erase are what made Johnny Quest legendary. The danger felt real, the stakes felt high, and the world felt bigger than a Saturday morning slot. By sanitizing it, networks stripped away the grit that made Johnny Quest unforgettable. The Alvin Show, 1961, 1962. When most people think of Alvin and the Frest Chipmunks, they picture harmless holiday tunes and squeaky voices. But the original Alvin Show was more than just cute harmonies. It was full of slapstick gags, cultural references, and moments that made networks nervous when reruns rolled out in the 60 seconds. The biggest problem? Alvin himself. As the ringleader of the trio, Alvin was brash, rebellious, and constantly pushing back against authority. For audiences in the early 60 seconds, this made him a star. But by the mid-decade, parents worried that kids were copying his smart-mouthed behavior. Some reruns muted or trimmed lines where Alvin insulted adults or manipulated situations to his advantage. Without those moments, episodes lost their comedic punch, and Alvin looked less like a cheeky leader and more like a watered-down sidekick. Slapstick scenes also took a hit. Physical gags where characters got bonked, crashed, or pulled off risky stunts were shortened, leaving behind awkward edits that made the pacing stumble. And then there were the cultural references. Episodes featuring beatnik characters, nightclub scenes, or sly jokes about fame and money were cut back to avoid complaints. For younger audiences who only saw the edited versions, The Alvin Show looked tame, almost bland compared to its original broadcast. What's fascinating is how different the uncut versions feel. Alvin isn't just mischievous. He's sharp, ambitious, and always one step ahead, which gave the show its spark. The unedited episodes reveal a cartoon that leaned harder into satire than most remember. By sanitizing Alvin's edge, networks accidentally turned one of the most rebellious kid characters of the era into something generic. Today, fans who find the original reels see a cartoon that was far riskier and funnier than its reputation suggests. The Alvin Show wasn't banned everywhere, but it was certainly reshaped into a softer version that never fully reflected the Chipmunks' original bite. The Mighty Hercules, 1000, 960, 966. On paper, the Mighty Hercules looked like a wholesome mythology lesson for kids, a muscled hero, a magic ring, and plenty of Saturday morning adventures. But this Canadian-American cartoon carried more bite than networks expected, and by the late 60 seconds, it was trimmed down and sanitized to fit safer standards. The uncut versions leaned surprisingly dark. Villains weren't just cartoonish, they were ruthless, sometimes tossed into volcanoes or trapped in ways that clearly hinted at grim outcomes. Broadcasters grew nervous that the show's sense of danger crossed into territory too heavy for children. Reruns softened these moments, replacing harsh endings with abrupt scene cuts or redubbed lines, suggesting villains simply ran away. The edits made the show clunky, breaking the flow of the mythic storytelling. Then there was the issue of humor. Hercules' companions, like Newton the Centaur, had catchphrases that grated on critics. But instead of removing just the irritating repetition, some stations trimmed large swaths of dialogue to shorten episodes and downplay confrontational banter. Add to that the edits of mild innuendo and slapstick deemed too rowdy, and you ended up with a neutered version of the original cartoon. International edits went even further. In some European countries, episodes involving sorcery and mythological curses were clipped, leaving audiences with fragmented stories that barely held together. Collectors who later uncovered the uncut reels were stunned at the difference. The show had originally been bolder, more violent, and more faithful to epic-style storytelling than anyone remembered. Today, the full versions show that the Mighty Hercules was a product of its time, roughly animated but ambitious in tone. The butchered reruns, however, stripped away its bite, leaving younger viewers wondering why it felt half-finished. The truth is simple. Networks couldn't decide if it was meant to thrill or babysit, so they chopped it until it barely did either. The Flintstones, 1000, 966. If you think The Flintstones was always a squeaky clean family sitcom, you're in for a surprise. The earliest episodes weren't just about Stone Age hijinks. They were peppered with habits and jokes that didn't survive later reruns. The biggest shocker? Fred and Barney lighting up Winston cigarettes right in the middle of their cartoon antics. The Flintstones wasn't originally marketed strictly as a kids' show. When it debuted, it aired in prime time, aimed at families who could appreciate humor about jobs, marriages, and neighbor squabbles. Sponsors played a big role, and back then, cigarette companies were among the most aggressive advertisers. Entire episodes featured commercial breaks where Fred and Barney puffed away, joking about how smooth their smokes were. At the time, nobody blinked. By the late 60 seconds, though, with attitudes changing, those segments became poison for broadcasters. They were cut completely, leaving strange gaps in early syndication prints. The edits went further than just ads. Some jokes about money, troubles, marital frustration, and even drinking at the Water Buffalo Lodge were softened or erased to make the show fit Saturday morning slots. Overseas, certain slang-heavy episodes were shortened to make dialogue safer for younger audiences. What emerged was a version of the Flintstones that looked family-friendly but lacked the sly adult humor that made it a hit in the first place. Watching the uncut versions today is eye-opening. They reveal a cartoon that was closer to the Honeymooners than to later Hanna-Barbera fare, a sitcom in animated form that spoke directly to grown-up concerns. The edits may have preserved the Flintstones for endless reruns, but they also buried the show's original edge. The irony is that by softening it, networks erased the very thing that made Fred and Barney feel so human. So there you have it, 10 cartoons from the 1,960 seconds that weren't as squeaky clean as you remember. Some were trimmed, some were banned, and others were sliced into strange, half-finished versions that only made sense if you never saw the originals. Which of these do you wish had aired in their full glory when you were a kid? Drop your thoughts below, hit subscribe for more deep dives, and remember, sometimes the edits tell us as much as the cartoons themselves.